the lightweight end of the feeder cattle have really accelerated here in the last 3 to 4 weeks.
Hi again, everybody. Welcome back to the Comstock channel. I'm Marlin Bohling with you. Always a pleasure to visit with you about ag-related topics. Today, my very special guest happens to be Derrell Peel. Now, he is a livestock economist specialist with Oklahoma State University. Don't know your official title, Derrell. I always just kind of throw that out there as a catch-all thing, but everybody knows you for your expertise in the cattle markets and the cattle industry and that sort of thing. So, thanks for joining us here. Hope you're having a good pre-Christmas season here.
Yeah, you bet. Well, it's my pleasure to visit with you again, Marlin.
Let's talk about some things that are affecting the livestock trade, mainly the cattle markets. And there's a lot of questions out there, Derrell. One here lately has been the issue of, you hear a lot of talk about the Mexican screwworm and its impact on cattle. Now, some people are telling me that that is why the feeder cattle market has been so high here for the past few weeks. But is that the whole story or not? And is that something that we really need to be afraid of at this point?
Well, there's several different issues here. Yeah, in terms of the market impact, I really don't think the screwworm, it's certainly supportive of the market. We did pull some cattle. They're not coming in from Mexico that would have come in. So that's supportive of the market in a short run sense. But I think this market was fundamentally strong, was going to take off, was already taking off actually before this happened. When we look back on this, I don't think we're going to be able to actually pick out, anything along this, this timeline here and say, oh, that was the screwworm impact. I think it's kind of relatively minor part of the overall market situation. The New World screwworm was an issue, a huge issue in the U.S. until about the 1960s and caused tremendous devastation. And so it was the subject of a lot of efforts on the part of the U.S. and Mexican governments to eradicate it, which we have done. But that's a constant battle. We've maintained ever since then a program that was initially located in southern Mexico and then moved down to Panama, eventually to release sterile flies every week to control the northward movement of that New World screwworm fly out of South America. And so it's an ongoing battle. It's something that never goes away. Most people are not familiar with that program, but we've been doing it for a long, long time. And in the last few months, apparently, it has kind of escaped that Panama barrier, moved up through central Mexico, and now has made its way into southern Mexico. So that's kind of the backdrop for the current temporary, and I think it is temporary, closure of the Mexican border to live cattle or livestock imports.
What kind of impact does that actually have on the animal if they get infected with that?
It's a devastating impact. It's a really horrible thing. So the fly lays their eggs in any sort of open wound, any open tissue, and when those eggs hatch, those larvae essentially eat the animal from the inside out. They eat living flesh. And so it's an absolutely devastating thing for the animals. Obviously, it causes huge economic losses, but from an animal perspective, it's just a horrible thing. And so it's something that we definitely do not want to get back. And the precautions are certainly, something we want to stay on to make sure that we don't have a problem with it.
So if an animal tests positive for that, is there even a treatment for it or not?
I think they can treat it. Now, we're kind of getting out of my field here, so I could get in trouble from a veterinary standpoint, but I think it's treatable. Usually they find it not so much as a disease detection, but it's a visual detection for the most part. I mean, they literally find the flies or the larvae on the cattle, and usually the larvae, and they can be treated. And if it's early enough and they haven't done too much damage, the animal can survive and do just fine. But again, if they exist for very long, they continue to replicate in that animal, and it just causes horrible devastation. And so, we haven't had the New World screwworm in the cattle industry for a long time. Again, we eradicated it in the early 1960s in the U.S., but there are occasional bouts of it re-emerging. I think most recently in 2017, after a hurricane, which is oftentimes the way those flies get moved, they got blown into the Florida Keys, and the screwworm showed up in some deer populations in the Florida Keys. And it took a few weeks to eradicate it back out. They did, and it never got into any cattle that I know of. So it's a constant battle. It just never goes away. It's something that we do, but right now it has jumped up in a little bit more of a way than we've seen in a long time.
Well, it seemed to be kind of a catchy topic in the news here in recent weeks, but from your perspective, is the market overreacting to that?
I don't think the market's overreacting. Again, I think the impacts that it's having directly on the market are really kind of lost in what else was happening. The market is moving very rapidly. These feeder cattle markets in particular have just been on fire lately, but I think it's largely for other reasons. The other thing to keep in mind is that we've closed the border. USDA is working with Mexican authorities on new protocols to reopen the border. Everybody seems to think it's going to be relatively temporary. Probably won't get back open before the end of the year. But as we get into January, I expect the border to reopen. And so the thing to keep in mind is that the feeder cattle that would have come in the last part of November and through the month of December will probably come anyway. And so we're changing the timing more than anything else, probably not changing the overall numbers of cattle that we're going to import. We're just going to push them off a few weeks. So we've got some immediate short run impacts that I think are relatively minor. And then longer term, we'll see those cattle come in as a part of next year's flow of cattle that we normally get from Mexico.
Does that mean they would come in heavier?
They might come in a little bit heavier. The fall of the year is when we import. November and December are the two biggest months for Mexican cattle imports typically. And that coincides with calf weaning there and kind of the end of their wet season. And so as pastures dry up and so on, they tend to wean and move calves out. So they'll probably hang on to those calves, and they will be somewhat heavier. I wouldn't think tremendously heavier, but yeah, they'll probably come in a little bit heavier than they would have otherwise.
Well, let's stay on the disease aspect or the pest aspect of livestock right now. Okay, the screwworm has been important lately. What about the issue with avian flu and its impact on dairy cattle? I was curious, why is it you never hear about that in beef cattle? Do you have an explanation for that?
Well, once again, we probably ought to visit with the veterinarians for a little more technically, appropriate response. But my understanding is that, probably we're not finding it in beef cattle, largely because we're not looking for it. It doesn't cause the kinds of impacts that we would naturally see. The nature of beef cattle production tends to be a little more extensive. We're not handling those cattle every day like you are dairy cattle. And we're not seeing the daily production like you do with milk production, where you would pick up on even relatively small changes in production. And so, I think it's there. The impact on the dairy industry it's not insignificant by any means, but in terms of, compared to what it does, obviously in poultry, where it is lethal, in cattle, it tends to be a relatively minor impact. And so we just haven't really had occasion to worry about it very much, I think, in the beef industry. But to say that it's not there, I don't think we can say that. There's probably been some of it in some beef cattle somewhere, but it doesn't seem to be a major issue.
Okay, let's talk numbers. I know you're a numbers guy and you like to track different categories of cattle and how they're moving around and that sort of thing. We've been trying for years to rebuild this cattle herd. Next chance we're going to get is going to be next spring. How optimistic are you that we're going to finally increase this cattle herd?
It's been a slow process. We thought even at the end of 2023, we could see some indications of the beginnings of heifer retention. Did not happen. The indications thus far through 2024 are likewise that we have no indication. If you look at heifer slaughter, which is kind of the ongoing data that we have available, the heifer on feed number from October was still very high. So yeah, it'll be next year as we move into 2025 would be the earliest that we think we'll see it. And of course, we will be getting the annual inventory numbers at the end of January. So that's when USDA will really confirm the inventory status of our breeding herd, but both cows and replacement heifers. But I say all that to say that it's been a slow process. I think it's going to likely to continue to be a relatively slow process. There's still some drought issues around, and maybe more importantly, some threats of drought that have producers, either still recovering in terms of their pasture situation, or maybe they're not really suffering immediately from the drought at this point in time, but they have concerns going forward. And so they're being very cautious. When you combine that with financial considerations, obviously the cost of financing herd rebuilding is much different now than it has been in the last few years. Certainly the last time we did this about a decade ago. And the other issues, people point out the demographics of the producer, the age of producers, and the fact that the current markets for some producers is an exit opportunity, and so that means a lot of transition. In and of itself, that might not mean that we're going to see a lot of decrease in overall production, but the transition takes time. And excuse me. So for all of those reasons, I think it's just a very slow process. Producers are moving very cautiously for very good reason, I think, in many cases. So even if we start in 2025, it's liable to be a relatively slow, deliberate process, and it's going to take some time.
Over the past few years, the market has been so high on cattle that there is no incentive to hold them back. The producers are incentivized to just send them to the market, cash
Sure.
in while the market is so high. Do you think the market is going to have to drop significantly just to entice producers to finally hang on to some animals?
Well, you can look at it two ways, and it's a short run, long run consideration. And this is really typical of every cattle cycle, right? So yeah, you're absolutely right. When the prices go up in the short run, obviously we want to take advantage of that. So we sell as many animals, including females, as possible. At the same time, those higher prices and our expectations for the future of market prices are what really provide the incentive to invest in future production. And so, if the market were to drop sharply, I think I would argue that that's less of an incentive to save heifers because we have no expectations of decent returns going forward. So it typically it involves kind of a tipping point where initially high prices encourages producers to sell and take advantage of the current market. But at some point in time, their expectations shift and they go, wow, maybe I need to rebuild the herd and invest in future production. So I'm going to go ahead and start saving in the face of expectations of continued opportunities for profitability in the future. And I think that's what we're still in at this point, is that the market is actually going to continue to offer higher prices as an incentive. And part of it has to do with the short run financial healing up, if you will, of producers. They sell for a year or two to kind of heal up from drought impacts and other things. Once they've done that, they can start thinking a little more forward, opportunities for investing. And I think at some point they will begin to save some heifers and look down the road a little ways and say, I need to be not thinking about just the immediate market, but what's the market going to be for the next several years.
So, okay, we're working at very lofty levels right now. So can a feedlot really make money producing cattle now, given the price of feeders being so expensive that they are right now? Compare the break even now to maybe where it was, let's say, a year ago, Derrell. How are the feedlots doing?
Well, feedlots have been fortunate thus far to kind of stay ahead of the market, if you will. But what generally happens in the market we're in right now, when you get into tight numbers, again, the market is sort of focused on the cow-calf level because that's the source of supply. We've got to incentivize that herd rebuilding. And the calf prices tend to go up farther and faster than feeder cattle prices. And the feeder cattle prices go up farther and faster than the fed cattle prices, which means that you get this margin compression that happens from the bottom up. And basically everybody above the cow-calf level, all the way to the consumer, is really in a margin business in this industry. So in general, in this kind of a market environment, we expect to see margin compression. Now, that may translate into losses. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's losses on every one. And part of it is the timing, right? So if we're chasing the market up, if you will, then, for a while at least, the fed cattle market stays ahead of the feeder cattle market. We've had a lot of cheapening of the cost of gain, if you will, as corn prices have come down in the last year or so, last few months. And that's helping feedlots in the short run. But the bottom line is they're going to continue to have lots of challenges with their margins. because going forward, I do expect higher feeder cattle prices, and I do think that feedlots will see some margin challenges going forward with the ability to process that. And again, everybody above the cow-calf level is experiencing these margin compressions that make it a real challenge we're going to pass along some of this all the way to the consumer, but we're not going to pass all of it along. So everybody along the way is going to feel the effects of some of this margin squeeze that's broadly affecting the industry above the cow-calf level.
I've been hearing a lot of talk about how feeder cattle producers are really taking advantage of exceptional growth on the winter wheat in the southern plains here this fall, and they're really tanking those animals up here. What do you hear in that regard? It sounds a little bit unusual for a change.
Yeah, well, we were very late getting started on the winter wheat prospects in the southern plains. We had extremely dry conditions from mid-July through October, at least here in Oklahoma. And then once the taps turned on right at the end of October, we got a lot of rain in November, a lot of wheat that was either not planted, got planted, or if it was planted, it was ready to go. And so we are going to have some late winter wheat prospects. Some of it is probably at least a month behind schedule. But that is part of the reason why these feeder cattle markets and calf markets in particular, or stocker markets, if you will, the lightweight end of the feeder cattle, have really accelerated here in the last 3 to 4 weeks. And that's certainly part of it, is that demand. So we're going to get to put some of these cattle out on winter wheat a bit later than usual, but better late than never, I guess, from the standpoint of that demand for those stocker cattle.
We have heard of some packer plant closures, some plant layoffs, but we've also heard of plant expansion. Are they kind of balancing each other out now?
Yeah, at this point in time, and it's a question I get a lot, are we likely to see, loss of capacity, if you will, in the industry? From a slaughter and fabrication standpoint, we're not seeing any loss of capacity at this point. In fact, as you noted, we've got some new plants coming online. So, that part has changed. The plant closure, the most recent one particularly that was announced, was a further processing plant. And so certainly the squeeze in cattle numbers, the squeeze in volume does have some impacts. My response to that question about capacity is that if we stay at reduced numbers long enough, we could see some plants, some companies make some decisions to reduce capacity. But I really don't see it happening very soon, or very likely even at this point in time. I think it would be a ways down the road before it would get that severe. Now, packing companies, by and large, are struggling. They're part of this margin compression that I talked about. So they largely are losing money in many cases. They're going to continue to, and they know that. So they're kind of girding themselves for getting through this for however long it takes over the next couple of years. And if it gets bad enough for long enough, then some of them might be forced to make some more permanent long-term decisions, but I don't think it's imminent and at this point in time.
Derrell, always great to talk with you. Thank you again for the time.
You
and
bet.
look forward to talking with you again next time. It may be after the first of the year. So in the meantime, I hope you have a terrific Christmas holiday, you and the family, and
You bet.
best wishes for a terrific 2025.
You too, Marlin. I enjoy visiting anytime. I'm happy to do it.
All righty. Take care of yourself. All right. That's Derrell Peel with Oklahoma State University. And that'll do it for this episode. Thanks again for joining us. Make sure you click on the bell icon down below so you can subscribe to these videos. Share these videos with others as well. We sure appreciate that. And add some comments down below. We always look at those also. Well, that'll do it for this show. For producer Brianne Jenkins, I'm Marlin Bohling, and we'll catch you next time right here on the Comstock channel. Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and or options is substantial, and each investor and or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.